Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and there is no doubt that when you think about the 16-bit era and you think about which console of the major console war between Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, when you think about which console typically had better graphics, I think a lot of people are going to lean more towards the Super Nintendo. A lot of people are probably going to feel like the Super Nintendo had better graphics overall, and that the Super Nintendo had better sound, better music for a lot of their games. On the other hand, I am the type of person who will go against the grain and argue that Sega was right up there with the Super Nintendo in terms of music, in terms of sound, but most importantly, in terms of graphics. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a ton of Sega Genesis games that just graphically were not up to par, could not hold a candle to the Super Nintendo. And I'm using Super Metroid because Super Metroid, while it's not the most graphically impressive game on the Super Nintendo, it is one of the most well-known games, and I think the graphics on Super Metroid is a happy medium. It has very colorful and chunky sprites, very immersive background areas. The sound in this game is great. The sound effects are great, and I think overall, Super Metroid is a classic example of what you could expect to get from Super Nintendo in terms of graphics and just the beautiful look of a game and the sound of a game. But there are some Sega Genesis games that I would say give the Super Nintendo a run for its money. And I'm going to run through a few of them right now. So let's go ahead and start off, first off, with Lightning Force. So Lightning Force is a side-scrolling shoot 'em up. This game has a lot of movement, a lot of bright and flashing lights, and I would almost say if you're prone to seizures, this might be a game that you may want to avoid just because of how much goes on in this game. But graphically, this is one of the most beautiful shoot 'em ups on the Sega Genesis, and that's saying a lot because the Sega Genesis does have a lot of shoot 'em ups. In fact, it is the premier console for shoot 'em ups. I would say if I had to buy a console just for shoot 'em up games, the Sega Genesis wins over the Super Nintendo, hands down. If you want to argue me in the comments, feel free to do so. But if you gave me your 5 best Super Nintendo shoot 'em ups, I could probably think of 10 more on the Sega Genesis that destroy them. So easily though, this definitely will go down as one of the prettiest shoot 'em ups on the Sega Genesis. I think this is a beautiful, beautiful game, and it's definitely one that would give the Super Nintendo a run for its money. Another game that I think gives the Super Nintendo a run for its money is Demolition Man. Obviously, this is based on the classic action thriller starring Wesley Snipes and Sylvester Stallone, as you see them on the cover there. But again, I love how a lot of these Sega Genesis games use, the bright neon colors, the bright reds, the purples, the oranges. And I mean, honestly, they just portray these games very well on the Sega Genesis. The music can sometimes feel a little bit more static, with the drums on some of these games being a little bit more staccato. But I would say that Demolition Man is definitely a good example when it comes to just very good looking sprite work on a game. Another example is Castlevania Bloodlines. Now, we did get a couple Castlevania games on the Super Nintendo. Obviously, we got Super Castlevania 4, and then we got Castlevania Dracula X. Not Dracula X. Geez Louise. Is it Dracula X? I think it's Dracula X. Sorry, I'm losing my mind. So yeah, so Dracula X. And honestly, I'm going to say that Castlevania Bloodlines does give Super Castlevania 4 a run for its money. I think that this game is right on par with Super Castlevania 4 in terms of graphics and music. But I will have to say that Dracula X definitely is a better looking game than both Bloodlines and Super Castlevania 4. Dracula X is just a beautiful game, to be quite honest with you. I know a lot of people have problems with the controls. My biggest issue with the controls on Dracula X is that once you jump in one direction, you have to be committed to that jump. You cannot switch directions midair, which sucks. That's my biggest gripe with that game, along with the fact that you cannot wield your whip in multiple directions. I think you can only wield it forward. So the controls on that suck, but I would say from a graphics perspective, Bloodlines does give Super Castlevania 4 a run for its money. I'm throwing Gunstar Heroes in this list because of the fact that I like really chunky, bright, sprites, especially with like run and gun shoot 'em ups. And Gunstar Heroes is like one of the godfathers of run and gun shoot 'em ups. I would put Gunstar Heroes right up there with the likes of like Contra and with the likes of like a Metal Slug. These games are definitely pioneers of the run and gun shoot 'em up genre, and I think that just the chunky sprites, the animations in this game are definitely right up there. And I think this gives pretty much any run and gun shooter on the Super Nintendo a run for its money. I mean, the most popular run and gun shooter on the Super Nintendo will probably be Contra 3 Alien Wars, and the graphics on that game are great. But Gunstar Heroes, I would say, is right up there with it. Ranger X, I think, is also one of those games graphically that, it can compete. It can definitely compete. The sprite work in this game isn't as chunky, but that's because there's a lot that they needed to fit on the screen between the different enemies that you have to battle, along with just, all the different attacks and animations that are going on in this game. But I think, again, great use of colors, great use of scenery. Not the biggest fan of the music in this game, but I think from a sprite and just, graphics level, I think this game does a pretty good job competing. I think they have some very unique looking backgrounds, some very interesting challenges on this one, and Ranger X is right there with it. I have to include this Disney game, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put a disclaimer. Most Disney games look good. For whatever reason, when Disney decides to invest in a game, the game itself is going to at least look great and sound great. And that's across every platform. I don't care what you say. You may not necessarily like the gameplay, you may not necessarily like the story, but what I've noticed in all Disney games, from Cold Shadow on the SNES to Tarzan on the PlayStation 1 to Disney games on the PS2, they always look great. They invest in great voice acting, obviously because it's Disney, and they always invest in just good looking visuals. So Pocahontas is no different, but I do think Pocahontas kind of stands out on the Sega Genesis. I know you have like Mickey's Castle of Illusion, a lot of the Mickey games that came out on the Genesis, but those Mickey games don't quite hold up as well as Pocahontas does. Again, this game is very immersive. The beautiful use of colors, the oranges, the reds, the browns, the purples, the violets, they just do a great job of bringing that Disney magic into this, 16-bit game. And I think, between that and the music, granted, a lot of the music is from the Pocahontas movie, but even if you're not a fan of like Pocahontas, this is definitely one of those games that you will enjoy. It's a slower paced game. This plays a lot more like a point and click style game. To be quite honest with you, it's not really like at least to me. It's been a while since I played this game. Somebody could correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but this wasn't really super like action packed, at least not to me. I played this a long time ago. It's been a while since I got back into Pocahontas. This was one that I really got for my kids when they become a little bit older. Yeah, oh yeah, this one does have the poster with it. Yeah, that's right. So I forgot, this is one of those Sega Genesis games that did come with a poster. My poster's actually been through it. But definitely one I say worth checking out just from a graphics perspective. And again, since we're talking about graphics in Disney, one of the better looking games on the Super Nintendo, again, Cold Shadow. That's definitely one I recommend. I like that Disney game. Out of like all the Disney games, I think Cold Shadow is one of my personal favorites. Out of every game on this list, I'm gonna have to crown X-Men 2 Clone Wars as probably the best, from my perspective, one of the best looking Sega Genesis games, like straight out of the gate. I'm gonna say that X-Men 2 Clone Wars looks better than most Super Nintendo games. If you've never had the pleasure of playing X-Men 2 Clone Wars, I highly recommend you check it out. The sprites in this one are not chunky, but they're actually fine enough to do a really good job of illustrating all of the different areas within like the X-Men universe. I think each character is honestly rendered with great detail, from Apocalypse to Cyclops to Magneto to Beast. I think the animations in this one are done very well. And just the way you start the game off immediately in attack mode, like the game, as soon as you put this cartridge in and you start the game up, you're already playing. There's no start menus, there's no nothing like that. You just dive right into the action. And then once you get through that first snow level, then you actually get to go to like your, you know, your title screen and everything like that. But X-Men 2 Clone Wars is probably the best. Again, if it's not the best, it's definitely top 5 in my opinion of best looking Genesis games. And I would say it definitely looks better than a lot of Super Nintendo games, most in fact. Very good looking game, and then the music in this one is done very well. I think this has great music, it has great sound effects. This is definitely one that's right up there for sure. And then last but not least, I'm going to say Batman, The Adventures of Batman and Robin on this one. Now, the thing that I like about The Adventures of Batman and Robin is that this one kind of adapts some of the kind of like that. If you grew up in the 90s and you grew up watching like Fox 5 or, you know, WB11, when they actually were airing these like Batman series, like Batman the Animated Series or Batman and Robin, they really do a good job of kind of portraying that same art style in this game. Which adds a heightened level of nostalgia for me. But again, even if you look at, I mean, just look at that sprite work right there, just on that art piece. I think this is like up there, man. This is right up there in terms of just graphical beauty, great use of sprites, the colors. I'm a sucker for like bright colors, like oranges, greens, just the contrasting colors there. I think they do a really good job with this one. And again, great animations. Not as big on the music in this one, but I think it's still a great looking game for sure. And if you have any interest in kind of doing any collecting for the Sega Genesis, I definitely recommend you checking these games out. A lot of these, from a loose cart perspective, a lot of these are super cheap. I mean, Batman, Adventures of Batman is like a $25 game. X-Men 2 might be a $20 game, loose cart. Same thing with Pocahontas. Ranger X might be a little bit more expensive. Gunstar Heroes is more on the expensive side. Same thing with Castlevania. Demolition Man, loose cart might be a little bit cheaper. Lightning Force is going to be more on the expensive side. So most of these games are not like ridiculously expensive. If you pick them up loose cart, you're not going to be paying much more than 25 bucks or so. Obviously, if you want to get them complete in box, that exponentially increases the price. Or if you want, as many on my channel like to do, you can always emulate them to see what the experience is. Or if you don't want to do any of that, just YouTube some gameplay footage and you'll see what I'm talking about. And you can let me know what you think. But let me know what you think down in the comments. I know there are not a ton of Sega Genesis fanatics out there. Not a lot of people are super hype on Sega, but I grew up on Sega. I'm a huge fan of the Sega Genesis. And I think, again, from a graphics perspective, when you're comparing this to some of what I saw on the Super Nintendo, I think these are definitely right up there. But let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.